The air in the classroom of the Galactic Academy crackled with tension. Professor Valtar Zever, a towering figure with eyes like liquid amber, glared down at his students, his alien features sharp and imposing. He was known throughout the galaxy as a brilliant mind, a master of diplomacy, and a revered educator. To him, the art of negotiation was the pinnacle of intelligence, far superior to any brute force or violence. His words were gospel, and the Academy's students had learned to worship at the altar of peaceful resolution. But today, a new challenge stood before him. Jack Carter, a human student from Earth, had come into the class with a reputation that preceded him, not for his academic brilliance, but for his extraordinary skills in combat and strategy. Jack had made it clear from the beginning that he had no interest in diplomatic theory. That was the realm of the weak. To him, action spoke louder than words. He was a warrior in a universe that revered negotiation. Professor Zever couldn't stand it. In a galaxy where the most powerful species had evolved beyond physical confrontation, humans still clung to the idea that strength and violence had their place. And Jack, with his human swagger and ancient sword slung at his side, epitomized that philosophy. The professor had often made remarks about human history, mocking the primitive ways of the Earthlings and their inability to rise above violent tendencies. But today, something about Jack's attitude pushed him too far. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," Zever sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you really believe that violence is the solution? That your primitive sword can solve the problems of this galaxy?" The students in the room were silent, waiting for Jack's inevitable reply. Some looked curious, others apprehensive. Zever's reputation as a scholar and diplomat was legendary, and no one dared to challenge him openly. But Jack was different. His gaze never wavered as he stepped forward, a quiet defiance in his eyes. "You want a lesson in strength, Professor?" Jack's voice was calm, but the tension in his stance was palpable. "I'll show you." In an instant, Jack's hand gripped the hilt of his sword. The ancient metal gleamed under the Academy's sterile lights. The room held its breath. Zever's eyes narrowed as the challenge hung in the air, the professor's arrogance quickly shifting to something more dangerous: uncertainty. He had made a mistake. Jack was no typical student. And now, the professor would learn what happens when you underestimate a human from Earth. The class was on the edge of their seats, and even Zever knew, deep down, that the game had changed. The Galactic Academy was a prestigious institution, a hub of learning that attracted the brightest minds from across the galaxy. Its towering spires reached toward the stars, and its vast corridors were lined with books and holoscreens that recorded the greatest achievements in science, philosophy, and diplomacy. Students from dozens of advanced species attended, each one trained in the subtle art of diplomacy, negotiation, and peaceful resolution. This was the heart of the galaxy's power, the place where the future leaders and diplomats of the universe were made. Professor Valtar Zever, however, had long become disillusioned with the peaceful rhetoric espoused by the Academy. He had seen enough of the galaxy's dark underbelly, the wars between species, the corporate greed, and the political manipulation. To him, the idea that diplomacy could resolve all conflicts was naive, a luxury that only the more advanced civilizations could afford. The professor had seen firsthand how power dynamics often skewed the paths of diplomacy, and he believed that only the strongest could truly influence the galaxy's future. And so, Zever taught the Academy's courses with a stern belief in the power of intellect. His classroom was a sanctum for ideas, a stage where the weak were tested against the might of knowledge. He often told his students that diplomacy was the art of war without the weapons, a subtle manipulation of influence, a dance of words, and a play of strategy. In his mind, the greatest minds in the galaxy were the true warriors, wielding knowledge as their sword. Jack Carter, a human from Earth, was an anomaly at the Academy. He was loud, brash, and unrefined in comparison to his peers. Whereas the other students arrived with years of diplomatic training and an innate understanding of galactic politics, Jack had only a basic understanding of what the Academy taught. His true strength, however, lay in something far older: the instincts of a warrior, the combat experience passed down from centuries of human conflict. He had learned early on that diplomacy, while important, would only get you so far when facing opponents who had no interest in words. Jack's father had been a decorated military officer, and his upbringing had been steeped in combat. His family had suffered losses in the brutal conflicts of Earth's past, and Jack had always been taught to value strength above all else. The death of his younger brother during a political negotiation that had turned violent had cemented Jack's view of the world. Peace was a fleeting dream, and only strength could ensure survival. To him, the idea of fighting with words was a fairy tale. So when Jack entered Professor Zever's class, it was clear from the outset that he did not share the professor's worldview. Jack was uninterested in the delicate nuances of negotiation, and he made no effort to hide his disdain for the Academy's approach to galactic diplomacy. He would often argue with Zever's lectures, claiming that no amount of peaceful negotiation could save you when an enemy's gun was aimed at your head. Zever, on the other hand, was determined to teach Jack the importance of diplomacy. The professor saw the human's attitude as a sign of primitive thinking, a throwback to a more barbaric time. He believed that if Jack could learn to harness the art of negotiation, he could transcend the limited scope of violence that seemed ingrained in his human nature. To Zever, it was a challenge. Could he teach the human the true power of diplomacy? Could he break through Jack's wall of arrogance and instill in him the knowledge that would change the way Earthlings viewed the universe? The tension between the two men had been building throughout the semester. Zever was certain that Jack's brashness was a sign of weakness, that his reliance on brute strength was simply a crutch. Jack, on the other hand, saw Zever as a deluded scholar, someone who failed to understand the realities of life outside the Academy's safe walls. The two perspectives couldn't have been further apart, and yet neither could truly grasp the value of the other. In that moment, as the class went silent and Jack unsheathed his sword, the tension reached its breaking point. The stakes had escalated far beyond a classroom debate. For the first time, both teacher and student realized that this wasn't just about the class. This was a test, not of diplomacy, but of strength. Not just of ideas, but of resolve. The academic facade of the Galactic Academy faded, and all that remained was the raw, unfiltered clash of two worlds. The delicate dance of diplomacy versus the primal force of combat. Both Zever and Jack were about to learn that there was more to strength than just force, and more to diplomacy than words. The lesson was about to begin, but not in the way either of them had ever imagined. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted in an instant. The quiet murmur of students, once engaged in the calm rhythm of academic discussion, fell to an abrupt silence. Professor Zever stood at the front, his sharp eyes narrowing as Jack Carter's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. It wasn't that Jack had been disrespectful up until that point. But when Zever had explained that the class's final challenge would focus on the art of peaceful resolution, Jack had scoffed. To him, peace was an illusion, a luxury for those who hadn't fought for their lives every day. Zever, sensing an opportunity to finally break through Jack's hardened exterior, had challenged him directly. If you believe in your violence so strongly, then demonstrate how it will achieve peace. The words hung heavy in the air. Jack's chest tightened. The challenge was clear, and he had no intention of backing down. He was here to prove that strength, not words, could dictate the flow of power. He rose from his seat with calm but deliberate steps, drawing his sword with a fluid motion. The weapon, an intricately forged blade with a glint that reflected the harsh lights of the classroom, was both an extension of Jack's will and a symbol of his worldview. Zever had never anticipated this. He believed that a simple rhetorical push, a demonstration of the power of negotiation, would be enough to force Jack to see the error of his ways. Instead, his student had weaponized the very thing Zever had sought to eliminate: brute force. There was no turning back now. With an air of arrogance, Jack raised his sword in a challenge to the professor. "Show me how your words can save us now," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of defiance. The hum of tension in the room was palpable. The students, once eager to see a theoretical test of diplomacy, now stared wide-eyed at the escalating standoff. Professor Zever, though surprised, did not flinch. His academic training had prepared him for all manner of intellectual challenges. But this was different. This wasn't a philosophical debate or an analysis of galactic politics. This was a battle of wills, and it had just become personal. "Your challenge is one of survival, not diplomacy," Zever replied, his voice laced with disappointment. "You've chosen violence over reason, as I expected. Very well, Carter. Let's see if your strength can triumph." The gauntlet had been thrown. The class was now a stage not for intellectual sparring, but for a clash of ideologies. And in that moment, both teacher and student were on the precipice of a confrontation that would define not just their beliefs, but the very nature of what it meant to wield power, whether through words or weapons. As the challenge was set, the classroom became a battlefield of tension. The students, many of whom had been taught by Zever for years, watched with a mix of fear and fascination. The environment that had once felt safe for learning and contemplation now seemed to pulse with an electric charge, like a live wire waiting to snap. Jack Carter stood firm, his posture relaxed but alert, his sword gleaming in the overhead lights. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the hilt, but his grip was controlled. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring into action. Jack was not merely reacting to the professor's words. He was setting the stage for a confrontation that would test his convictions. Professor Zever, on the other hand, was frozen in the moment, his thoughts racing. He had faced challenges before: intellectual debates, diplomatic negotiations, and even physical duels with fellow academics. But this was different. His expertise lay in rhetoric and diplomacy, not the art of combat. He was a master of words, of logic and persuasion. He was not a warrior. Yet here he stood, faced with the embodiment of a world he'd never truly understood, one where the might of a single individual could tilt the balance of power. Jack was no ordinary student. His origins as a human from a harsh, unforgiving Deathworld had imbued him with strength and survival instincts far beyond the norm. He was a warrior in every sense of the word, and now his teacher would learn just how dangerous such a force could be. Zever lifted his hand in an effort to calm the situation, his voice steady yet tinged with authority. "Jack, this is not the way," he called out. "You've chosen violence over understanding. We can resolve this without a fight." But his words fell flat. Jack was already too far gone, too eager to prove his point. Without further warning, Jack lunged forward with a speed that belied his size. His movements were sharp and calculated, a precise blend of strength and agility honed over countless battles. He swung his blade toward Zever, the sharp edge cutting through the air with a whistle. The sound was almost haunting, a reminder that this was no longer a theoretical contest. This was real. Zever's first instinct was to retreat, to avoid the strike and de-escalate the situation. He was not trained for physical combat, especially not with someone like Jack. He sidestepped just in time, feeling the whoosh of the blade pass dangerously close to his face. The narrow miss left him shaken, his breath coming in quick gasps. Despite his fear, Zever had no choice but to engage. He couldn't back down, not in front of the students, and not when his credibility as an educator was on the line. He raised his hands, attempting to block the next incoming strike with his forearms, but Jack was relentless. His strikes were fast and precise, aimed at testing the professor's limits rather than aiming to cause real harm. Zever struggled to defend himself, his body stiff and uncoordinated. His hands trembled as he attempted to parry Jack's strikes, but he was out of his depth. Each blow from Jack pushed him back, his feet stumbling as he struggled to regain his footing. The professor had underestimated his student's capabilities, thinking that words and reason would hold more power than raw strength. Jack's next strike came quickly, almost too fast for Zever to react. With a twist of his wrist, Jack delivered a light blow to the professor's side, not enough to injure him, but enough to send him sprawling to the ground. Zever's breath caught in his throat as the reality of the situation sank in. His worldview was crumbling before his eyes. Jack was right. Strength could overpower diplomacy, at least in the short term. The room was silent, save for the sound of Zever's labored breathing as he lay on the floor, staring up at his student. Jack stood over him, his sword raised, but his expression was not one of malice. He had proven his point. He was capable, he was strong, and he had demonstrated to the professor exactly why violence had a place in the galaxy. "You wanted to test me, Professor," Jack said, his voice cold but measured. "Now you know what happens when you push a Deathworlder too far." Xever, still stunned, finally managed to lift himself off the floor. His hands were trembling, his pride wounded, but there was no denying the truth of the situation. Jack had made his case, loud and clear. The teacher had failed to understand the cost of underestimating a human from a world where survival depended on strength. This was no longer a battle of ideals. It was a reminder that some lessons could only be taught through pain, and for Xever, that lesson had just been learned in the most brutal of ways. Professor Xever lay on the cold floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, desperately trying to process what had just happened. The elegant, calculated arguments he had relied on for decades had crumbled under the weight of raw power and force. Jack Carter, the human student he had so often mocked, had proved him utterly wrong. And now, Xever was left to face the bitter reality that his worldview had been shattered in a matter of minutes. The silence in the room was deafening. The other students, once so eager to watch this intellectual showdown, now stood frozen in place. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared at the fallen professor with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant. The human student Jack had not only proved his strength, but also shown the professor and the entire class that strength, in certain situations, could be the key to survival. Jack's sword was lowered now, the blade gleaming in the harsh artificial light of the Academy's lecture hall. He didn't gloat or revel in his victory. His expression remained calm, almost detached, as if the fight had been nothing more than a formality to prove a point. His stance, though relaxed, still carried the latent power of someone who had never been afraid to use force when necessary. But there was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, unwavering certainty. Xever, however, was anything but calm. The professor's pride had taken a severe blow, and his mind struggled to reconcile the events with everything he had believed about the universe. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to diffuse tension with words and reason. But today, he had seen how quickly a student like Jack could dismantle that very philosophy with nothing but sheer will and skill. This wasn't the galaxy he had envisioned. This wasn't a place where diplomacy and reason triumphed. Instead, it was a galaxy where might often prevailed, and Jack, the human he had underestimated, had proven it in the most humiliating way possible. Xever finally pushed himself up from the floor, his body aching from the blows, his pride bruised far worse than his physical form. He met Jack's gaze, and for the first time, he saw the raw resolve in the young human's eyes, a resolve that had carried him through countless battles, through the harshest of environments, and had now been unleashed in the form of a challenge that Xever could not dismiss. "You've made your point," Xever said, his voice hoarse but tinged with reluctant respect. "But what happens when brute force isn't enough? What if the galaxy faces a problem that cannot be solved with violence?" Jack didn't respond immediately. He stood there, his sword now resting at his side, considering the professor's words. It was clear that Xever's mind was still wrestling with the defeat, trying to rationalize what had just happened. He had spent his life preaching that diplomacy and intellect were the only paths to power, and yet Jack had just shown him how power could be wielded differently. It wasn't about brute force, it was about the context, the purpose, and the moment. "Maybe you're right," Jack finally said, his voice steady. "Maybe you can't solve everything with violence. But you sure can solve a lot of things when people like you underestimate the people you're dealing with. Sometimes, survival doesn't give you the luxury of diplomacy. Sometimes, it just comes down to who's willing to fight." Xever's face tightened, but there was no denying the truth in Jack's words. He had been too quick to dismiss the potential of the human race, too wrapped up in his own ideals to see that strength and intellect were not mutually exclusive. He had seen humans as a primitive species, but Jack had forced him to realize that humanity had something that many other species lacked: the ability to adapt, to learn, and to fight when necessary. Zever's shoulders slumped as the weight of his own defeat settled in. The students in the room remained silent, all watching their professor as he processed the full scope of his mistake. They had all come here to learn about diplomacy, about negotiation, about finding peaceful solutions to galactic problems. But in the face of this confrontation, they had learned something far more profound, that sometimes even the greatest minds had to be humbled in order to grow. "I've underestimated you, Jack," Zever admitted quietly. His voice no longer filled with the arrogance that had once marked his every word. "I see now that strength isn't just about words. It's about knowing when to stand firm and when to act. You've shown me that there's more to diplomacy than what I've taught." The apology, though not spoken with ease, carried weight. Jack nodded once, his gaze steady and respectful. There was no need for further words. The lesson had been learned, and it had been earned through action, not theory. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, the students slowly began to return to their seats. The professor, no longer the unchallenged authority figure, stood in the center of the room, humbled. Jack, his sword now resting on his shoulder, turned and walked toward his desk. He didn't need to say anything else. He had already won, and in the process, had taught his teacher something far more important than any lesson in diplomacy could have conveyed. Professor Zever watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that perhaps the true strength of the galaxy lay not in the power of one's words, but in the courage to face what one had failed to see. The class remained silent, the weight of the duel hanging in the air. No one moved, as if the space around them had become suspended in time. Jack Carter had stood up to Professor Zever, a figure revered by all, and had won not with brute force alone, but with strategy, skill, and unwavering confidence. The professor, now visibly humbled, stood silently at the front of the class, the once unchallenged authority in the room now uncertain, his mind wrestling with the painful reality of his defeat. Zever had always prided himself on being able to solve problems with intellect and diplomacy. He had shaped the curriculum to highlight the importance of negotiating through conflict without resorting to violence. His reputation as an intellectual giant had made him untouchable in the eyes of the students, but now that reputation was in tatters. The lesson he had just learned was not from a classroom, but from the unspoken power of human resolve. After a long pause, Zever spoke, his voice quieter than usual, almost reluctant. I see now that my approach was too narrow," he began, the words a painful admission. "I believed that all conflicts could be solved with words and persuasion. But today, you showed me that there is more to strength than intellect. You've proven that actions speak louder than rhetoric in certain situations." Jack, who had quietly returned to his desk after the confrontation, sat with a calm expression. His sword, still sheathed at his side, was a reminder of the world he came from, a world where survival meant mastering the art of both strength and intelligence. He didn't expect Zever to suddenly change overnight, but he hoped this moment would mark a turning point, not just for the professor, but for the rest of the class. Zever glanced around the room, his eyes meeting the gazes of the other students. For the first time, the professor saw their expressions shift. It wasn't the usual respect or reverence they had shown him before. Instead, there was something new, understanding. Jack had proven that strength, when paired with wisdom, was not something to be feared or dismissed. It was something to be respected. "I've failed you as a teacher," Zever continued, his gaze now fixed on Jack. "I judged you, and I judged your species, without understanding what drives you. Today, you've shown me that strength is not just physical power, it's the ability to survive, adapt, and rise when challenged." Jack nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't speak. He wasn't here for an apology. He wasn't here to prove that humans were superior to any other species. All he had wanted was for his professor to see that strength, whether in battle, survival, or intellect, had value in every corner of the galaxy. He had been fighting against the misconception that humans could only solve problems with violence. In that moment, Jack had proven that humans were capable of far more than their violent history suggested. The students, once hesitant and unsure, began to shift in their seats. The tension had slowly started to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of respect. They had just witnessed something remarkable. A human had not only stood up to the might of a powerful alien professor, but had also taught a lesson in strength, humility, and adaptability. Jack had shown them that diplomacy didn't always have to come from perfect words. It could come from action, courage, and the willingness to confront difficult truths. Xever moved towards the front of the room, his movements slower now, as though every step was weighed down by the gravity of his reflection. He paused before addressing the class one final time. "Let us all learn from today's lesson," Xever said, his voice firm but tinged with newfound humility. Diplomacy is not just about talking, it's about understanding. It's about realizing that every conflict, every challenge has many layers, layers that go beyond words, beyond ideologies. Sometimes, strength is needed to show what diplomacy cannot. The class nodded, understanding the depth of Xever's transformation. The human student, Jack, had shaken the very foundation of what they thought they knew. And in doing so, he had not only changed the professor's perspective, but had forever altered their own understanding of what it meant to be strong. As the class adjourned, Jack lingered in his seat for a moment, watching as the other students filed out, some giving him respectful nods, others with thoughtful expressions on their faces. He had not only changed their view of him as a human, but he had changed their view of the universe. Strength was no longer just about force, it was about adaptability, resilience, and knowing when to fight and when to speak. Professor Xever, his pride wounded, but his mind expanded, watched Jack as he left the room. For the first time in a long while, Xever smiled slightly, but with genuine respect. Today, his student had taught him the most important lesson of all. As the class ended and the students slowly filed out of the room, a new silence settled in. The atmosphere was different now. A sense of change lingered in the air. The events that had unfolded, the unexpected confrontation between Jack and Professor Xever, had rippled through the classroom in a way no one could have predicted. What had begun as a simple challenge had transformed into something much deeper, something that would echo through the minds of all who witnessed it. Jack Carter had not just proven his physical strength. He had shown the class that strength and wisdom were not separate entities, but two sides of the same coin. His battle with the professor wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about forcing others to confront their assumptions, to reconsider what it meant to be powerful. It was about showing that humanity, despite its violent history, had the potential for adaptability, intellect, and, most importantly, restraint. Professor Xever, once the unchallenged authority on diplomacy, had learned a humbling lesson. He had spent years teaching that negotiation was the only path to true power, but now he realized that power could take many forms. The strength to stand up, to hold your ground, and to navigate conflict with both intellect and force was as much a part of diplomacy as any negotiation tactic. The lesson Jack had taught him, though painful, was invaluable. Xever had been forced to look beyond his own beliefs and acknowledge that diplomacy was not a one-size-fits-all solution. For the students who had watched, it was a moment of awakening. They had come to learn about the delicate art of diplomacy, but they left with a deeper understanding of what true power looked like. It was not just the power to talk your way through a situation, but the power to act decisively when words weren't enough. Jack's victory had shown them that strength didn't have to be wielded mindlessly. It could be a tool for understanding, growth, and even peaceful resolution when used with wisdom. As the door to the classroom clicked shut behind him, Jack Carter walked out, not as a student who had just won a battle, but as someone who had changed the course of the lesson for everyone involved. In his silence, in his sword, he had taught the most important lesson of all. True strength lies in knowing when to act and when to speak. And for the first time, the entire class understood.